The following conversation is a meta-commentary on the growing cultural phenomenon that's now known as the intellectual dark web. Some of the public figures associated with the intellectual dark web include Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Brett and Eric Weinstein, Christina Hoff Sommers, and Ben Shapiro, to name a few. If you're familiar with some of these figures and their work, you've read Barry Weiss's New York Times piece on the subject, or you seek a deeper understanding of what the intellectual dark web is about, this discussion is for you. Okay, here's the show. I'm Travis, and this is Grokking Points.
Welcome to Grokking Points. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the intellectual dark web. I'm here with my co-host, Travis.
Hello.
Hi. I'm Alex, and let's just get into it.
All right, I vote for Vaporwave for the intro music.
You don't want to do JBG wave? Jordan B. Peterson wave?
That's actually a really good idea.
Yeah, have you listened to them?
Yeah, I did.
They're amazing.
Yeah.
I've been listening, they have a playlist of all of Akira's ones, and I've been listening to them as I program, and it's really fun. And then sometimes I'll hear something and I'll be like, oh, I kind of remember that. I want to go re-listen to that episode. But then it's just sampled, so I can't find where he had said these things. Anyway, so today the topic of conversation is the intellectual dark web.
Right. We're just going to talk about what is it, where it came from, what the core ideals are, who makes up this group of people, and kind of just what we think about it.
Yeah.
So we'll start with the name, since we both have opinions about that.
Yeah.
What do you think about this name for this community now?
I would say at first I thought it was pretty goofy, and I think you're on the it's goofy train right now.
I think it's pretty goofy.
Okay, it's pretty goofy. And on the Sam Harris sub, Sam Harris is supposedly one of its members. People were pretty...
A founding member,
yeah. People were pretty upset by it. They thought it was similar to, it should belong on r/cringe. It's just like people being pretentious about about how cool they are. And to be fair, it jives with the pictures that were associated with the intellectual dark web on the Barry Weiss article about it. But on reflection, I actually think it's a pretty good name. I think it sounds silly because of it. Well, one, it's very new, and names at the beginning usually sound a bit silly because they're new. No one's familiar with them. And then the more you use it, the more normal it would sound. Like if you just invented the word door, you might think door sounds really stupid, like a door, whatever. But I mean, it's a door. If you just said it, it makes sense. Okay. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a reverse of when you say a word, the unknown word, enough that it loses its meaning.
Right.
Kind of the reverse of that. Right. Yeah. I mean, I'll concede that it's less goofy now when I see it than it was when I first saw it. When was it Brett or Eric that came up?
It was Eric Weinstein.
Right.
I think was the one or Weinstein. I don't know how he likes to be called.
Yeah, I keep forgetting this.
Yeah.
Because it's very specifically one of them.
Well, everyone in the world basically agreed that because Harvey Weinstein is how you pronounce Harvey Weinstein.
Okay.
So after that scandal, all of the Weinsteins in the world were like, it's Weinstein.
Yeah.
It's Weinstein.
Yeah. So it is Stein, because I know it's different than Harvey's last name.
Right.
So yeah, so it's Eric Weinstein.
Right.
Okay. So he kind of came up with this term just offhand. I don't know if it was in the moment he just kind of it vomited out of his mouth, or if he ever I don't
think he did any focus groups on it or
anything.
I
can't imagine he intended it to even catch on at all. I don't know if he's happy or not about this being the word, but I mean there's definitely something that we're pointing to when we talk about this word. There's definitely a community of people that can be described under kind of one phrase. And if this is going to be the phrase, then fine. I mean, I still don't like it, but okay, tell me what's dark about it. What's the dark web connection?
Well, originally, there's two aspects of this. There's the intention or the purpose behind the original coining, which was, as you said, Eric Weinstein, more or less riffing and just coming up with something on the spot. And then there's the fact that it actually caught on and that people are using it, and that it's as far as we know right now, it's the best way to refer to this community and this concept. And maybe if we had something different that was cooler, we would use it.
Well, you said it's a good term now. You like it now.
I'll go into that.
Okay.
So originally when it was coined and he riffed and he said intellectual dark web, I mean, presumably this guy is very tech savvy and he manages a lot of money. I'm sure he's familiar with the dark web. Oh, he's also like adjacent to the crypto asset community ecosystem. And so I'm sure he was originally thinking of the dark web, meaning like where you could go online that wasn't through traditional channels and you can use it to buy drugs or get porn or pirate music or whatever. And it was, you're communicating over the same like physical channels, like you're still using the internet, but it's in a protocol or using platforms that mainstream people didn't use. So that's what makes it dark in addition to the web. And so I think when he was thinking about it, he had some vague idea of the spirit behind that, but he didn't totally think it through. He just said, it's intellectual, obviously, because it's people who literally their livelihood is to talk about topics intellectually, either on podcasts or in written form. And a lot of them are professors in psychology or biology. And they have PhDs. And like Eric, he's a manager of a hedge fund. Or not of a hedge fund, but of a capital, of a trust, investment trust. And he probably has, I think he has a PhD in math or something, right? So they're clearly intellectuals. They're clearly in an intellectual space. And so he was like, it's an intellectual something. And I'm trying to go for this vague idea of, not mainstream. So I'll say dark web.
Some kind of alternative space. Yeah, right. I mean, I guess
sorry. And then just real quick. So the second part of that is, why did it catch on, and why are people actually using it, and why is this the unique identifier for the group instead of, some people a while ago were saying the dark enlightenment, and some people were saying it's just like classical liberalism, so they're using an older term that referred to something different, and those just didn't work. They were either referring to something different, or they didn't accurately describe the community. And so you could say, well, let's just create a word that does it better, but this word, it's not like it was imposed from the top down. Someone just spit it out one time and everyone gathered around it naturally. Right. And they, in linguistics, you don't get to just choose a word. The word emerges out of its usage. And I think it does have the elements that you need to have in the word. I mean, first of all, it's obviously intellectual, the movement and community we're talking about. It's predominantly online, even though people will meet up in person and have like interviews and stuff. Eventually that's just going to go on YouTube or a podcast. And same with the speaking events, like 500 people will show up to a speaking event and then 500,000 will watch it online. So it's definitely web-based in large part, and it emerged out of the podcast YouTube ecosystem.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the main objection here, though, is that it's not that dark. It's not as dark as the dark web is, certainly.
Well, but it depends what you mean by dark, because in the dark web, you could say part of the meaning is that, people were maybe doing sex trafficking or like murdering over it. So it's dark in the sense that it's like evil or bad. Which I don't know if that's where you were getting at, but that's an association with it anyway. But I think when they say dark, they don't mean dark as in like it's bad, or even that no one's paying attention to it, because people obviously are. They mean dark as in it's not going through the traditional channels. So in this case, in the intellectual dark web case, the traditional channels would be stuff like mainstream media. It would be, whether it's like it could be on TV, it could be mainstream media online outlets, it could be like universities, university professors, and the contention is in the places where people in Western society think about ideas being shared, which would be through the mainstream media or through the university. They don't think about those are the spaces where these ideas aren't being discussed.
Right, but it's not like Sam Harris has never been on TV. I mean, I've seen people say that Bill Maher is like close to this community, if not in this community, and he's got his own show on HBO. Yeah, no, that's wrong. I mean, I think that the key thing is there. It's not that none of these people are like known; they're not secret. It's not like anonymous. So in that sense, it's not the same as the internet dark web, but it's similar in that the network, the way that the community and the way they're networked together is not what is mainstream. Right. So usually what's mainstream is
like say you're on Fox and Friends or something, and then you might have Jordan Peterson come on and do like a segment a couple times, and so you could say, oh, Jordan Peterson's mainstream now because he's on Fox and Friends. But if you think about it another way, if you have Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Dave Rubin, whatever, and you put them together in a room, they're not running Fox and Friends. So they're not the central, if you turn on TV at like 7 p.m.
They don't own the means of production.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. I mean, they use means creatively, such as YouTube or podcasts, which more and more people are being attracted to now. But they're not going through the traditional channels. They're not hosting radio shows. They're not on like a department at a university, for instance. Or I mean, they're in departments, but they're not like a department chair or I'm just trying to think of like channels for disseminating information. And so it's really not about secrecy or even that they're not well known. It's that they're not going through the traditional channels, and that's where they're referred to as dark web. Is new
media a good term for this?
New media is decent, except that they're also in large part they don't tend to have like really large fan bases in places like Facebook.
Yeah.
And they don't, sometimes you might be using new media to refer to stuff like New York Times or the Huffington Post, or basically old media that is just, to count new media, you could also say like BuzzFeed or Vox, which is media outlets that are going online. I don't know. I don't know if I would really consider it the same way.
Right. Well, I mean, you see,
would you call PewDiePie new media?
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't know if I would call New York Times new media. Mm-hmm. And there's almost a paradox here where, we're saying that these are ideas that aren't in the mainstream, and they're being introduced via New York Times, which is about as mainstream as you can get.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're not being introduced through New York Times. They're profiled through New York Times after they already gained prominence.
Right.
So, like, for instance, the New York Times wouldn't just go and talk to Ben Shapiro and ask him about, like, his perspective on policy or whatever. They would only, they might ask him about that, or they might profile him after he's already very famous and has a huge following, and then they're basically just reporting on the news. They're like, here's a guy who's famous and has a huge following, let's like ask him what's going on. But they're not bubbling up that information. They're not taking it from something that's small and not prominent and then spreading it.
Right Okay, so what are the ideas that are being discussed here then? Like, if what we're talking about is ideas that aren't in the mainstream, what are those ideas? What are the core values that connects this group that we need a label for them?
Right. Well, I would say one thing to look at is how the group emerged. Basically, what were people talking about when they became prominent? So with Peterson, he's been working for a very long time, and he had like a much smaller following earlier, but he became famous and really got on the map when a video that he was in went viral, which was he was protesting against this bill in Canada, Bill C-16, which was legislation that said if you misgender a person, that's a violation of their human rights. And so, among other things, but that was Peterson's contention.
That's what he argued.
Right.
The implications of the legislation.
Right. And it wasn't actually him arguing that went viral. It was a group of social justice warriors protested, and then they argued with Peterson, recorded it, they uploaded it, and then that's what went viral.
Right.
So it wasn't Peterson being like, oh, look at all these like stupid liberals, let's make fun of them. They were like, look at this stupid professor. He doesn't get like trans issues, or not even stupid, but somehow like violent or hateful, or like this person's a problem. And that's what made him rise to prominence. So in his case, it was like he was in some way speaking out against I don't know if you would call it the majority, because the trans activists in particular were definitely a minority, but they represented the majority identity politics.
It's a vocal minority that's kind of being appeased to by the majority.
Right. I mean, by their own philosophy, it wouldn't really make sense if it was being led by like straight white people, because the whole point is they would want the people who were most affected to be representing the cause. So that's why they're protesting. But anyway, so that's how Peterson came to prominence. Harris, he had been prominent for a really long time as part of the New Atheists. So he was, I guess, doing the same version, but in a different incarnation, because however long ago it was when he became famous, maybe 20 years ago or sometime in the 90s. A bunch of the New Atheists started being famous by popularizing ideas around atheism and questioning like norms and doctrines of organized religion, including Christianity at the beginning, and then later Islam, especially after, as conflict in the Middle East has escalated and there's been increased like terrorist attacks and such. So Harris has always been sort of dark webby in the sense that he was always like bucking the trend. And even back then when he was, it was Harris, Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Dan Dennett.
Right.
And they were considered the Four Horsemen. And that's its own level of cringiness over there. It was in some way natural for Harris to enter into this space because he had always been talking about stuff that was against the mainstream.
Yeah, and he almost has some kind of pleasure in it, I think.
Right.
he likes being embroiled in these kind of things.
Yeah. It's slightly different because when he was arguing against Christian theocracy or morality, he was an underdog in terms of the, maybe you could say, majority of opinion in the US. But if you were in liberal circles or if you're in more like atheist circles, he wasn't extremely controversial. And so he would have called himself on the left for a very long time because he would be against sort of like right, conservative, fundamentalists, traditionalists, fundamentalists religiously, I mean. And so tying all this back in, the way that he entered the intellectual dark web was around when he started talking about Islam. Because when he started talking about Islam, there was this sort of paradox in Western liberalism or Western progressivism where there's sort of anti-right-wing Christian theocracy, but then they wanted to also protect Muslims because Muslims and they're anti the right Christian theocracy because that was the majority of opinion. It was most of America. But now Muslims represented a minority in America, and they started suffering persecution in response to the 9/11 attacks, or discrimination or racism or whatever. And so Sam was pretty much, maybe at the beginning, he was equally against Islam and Christianity. And at some point he was like, oh, actually Islam is a bigger threat because of the terrorist attacks and because of, threats globally. So the left basically turned on him, or maybe they were never on his side in the first place. And they said, hey, you can't speak out against this oppressed minority. That means you're Islamophobic. And he's like, Islamophobic? Like I've been criticizing religion for my whole career, right? Or more or less. And so he started becoming more aware of the harms of, or more tuned, I guess, to the harms of identity politics. And that started becoming part of his platform. So on his podcast, where he was initially talking about stuff like consciousness and meditation and science and like the nature of reality, eventually, while also talking about atheism and new atheism, eventually he got embroiled in this culture of being anti-American left, or they call it the regressive left, anti-identity politics, pro-free speech, and pro, I guess you would say, Western liberal democracy, Enlightenment values, stuff like that.
Yeah, I guess what I'm curious about here is a lot of the ideas here that bring these thinkers together. They're not necessarily not mainstream ideas. Like they're not ideas that you just never see if you go on CNN or Fox News or wherever you go to get your news. But they're ideas that are largely espoused by conservatives in conservative circles.
Well, it depends on the context. Right now, that is true. But that wasn't true if you were talking about conversations about free speech, say like, 50 years ago or something.
Yeah, but I mean, who was attacking free speech 50 years ago? It's a different group of people now. So like right, obviously the far right conservatives are going to be concerned about the far left progressives threatening free speech, however small of an issue that's going to be. If this was one or two protests, and when it was just one or two protests, it was all over Daily Wire, The Blaze, all these conservative news blogs.
Sorry, what protests are you talking about?
So like the first few, like say, the first one I remember was in maybe 2013 when a men's rights activist speaker was protested at a university in Toronto. I think I don't remember his name. And that was like kind of a total one-off event, it seemed like. And since then, there's been a few more of these, and it's still not like, I don't think it's as big a problem as the far right makes it out to be, but I don't think it's as small a problem as the moderate left makes it out to be, I guess, like the Sam Cedars.
Who are you talking about when you say far right?
Let's say like Well, it's not even far right all the time. It's like Reason.com and Quillette.
Okay, so you just mean right. You just mean conservative.
Yeah. Like anybody who's not Vox, HuffPost, you know.
So you did that same thing. You called them far right. You're part of the problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of my point is that obviously the far right's gonna have a hair trigger on this stuff.
You mean the right?
No.
About the far right?
I'm talking about the far right too. Like of course the far right is gonna have a hair trigger about anything that progressives do that looks moderately like infringing some kind of amendment. I mean, I guess the question is like, why are there suddenly centrists concerned about this now? Mm-hmm. And like, is this a centrist concern or is it just kind of a conservative concern?
You mean the concern being that free speech is in trouble?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that, first of all, if you go back a little bit, there's this more recent phenomenon. Jonathan Haidt talks about this. He talks about the campus free speech issues a lot, and Haidt argues that it's getting worse now, and it's especially getting worse on the left. I think if you go back, I'm not an expert in this, but I think if you go back, say, 20 years, if you're talking about things like protests against speakers and like campus disinvitations or whatever, it was probably either roughly equal between right and left, or it might have even been more so from the right, because there used to be fairly strong like anti-communist sentiment or anti-gay, and they would try to, like, for instance, maybe at a again, I'm kind of making this up, but I'm just imagining at like a really Christian college or a very conservative college, they might disinvite a speaker who was going to, or not disinvite, but, you know, protest a speaker who's going to talk about abortion, for instance,
sure,
pro-choice. And so from their perspective, they might say that's like outside the realm of acceptable discourse. So then the left could reasonably argue that's a violation of free speech from the right. But it's just that now, in the last maybe 5-10 years, we're seeing increasing trends of people on the left shutting down speech. And there's also a weird irony here where you were mentioning the protests. To the untrained ear or someone not following this, they might think protests, oh, that's free speech, because they're exercising their right to assemble, right? Peaceably assemble. And then that makes you go and think about the free speech movement in the 60s. And at least the thing that was happening around Berkeley, and the reason that protests are relevant, is because people would protest invited speakers. So like a conservative group would invite someone like Milo Yiannopoulos to come and talk to them, and then people on the left would protest it. And then so now the charge is that the protest that might have previously be considered an exercise of free speech, now it's viewed as actually shutting down speech, because they're sort of going out of their way to make it more difficult for a speaker to speak, or for a community to exercise their own rights. So when we're talking about a protest in this modern context, we're generally not talking about acceptable or encouraged exercising of free speech. We're talking about an act to attempt to shut down some other group's free speech.
Yeah, but not all of the protests go that far, right? Like,
yeah, certainly not.
We really just kind of hear about the ones that do, and there's not. I mean, how many colleges are there in America? How many colleges have we learned the name of just because, you know, some protest happened at them? I don't think that this is like such a widespread problem that necessarily Congress is going to start passing laws about it. I just don't see this as something that's happening at every college every time some conservative shows up. It's usually some kind of big name YouTube person that a lot of people on the far left have a problem with. Like, probably half of these protests that go too far are Milo, mm-hmm. I imagine, and maybe just people related to Milo. So,
well, it does depend what you're talking about when you're talking about a protest, because I mean, it's hard to say what would happen in an alternate universe, but my guess is that most of the intellectual dark web pro-free speech people wouldn't be nearly as concerned if the people on whether it's on the left or whoever it is that is protesting, if they sort of just like stood outside and held signs or like sat on the ground. But usually what happens is there's either, even if you're ignoring the most extreme, like stuff that turns into riots or, you know, people breaking windows or starting fires or attacking the speakers in question, which has happened a couple times of note. But to your point, maybe that's like an anomaly. But I would say as far as I can tell, in like a good number of cases, the express intent of the protesters is to like make a lot of noise and to like get in the way of other people. So for instance, they'll do stuff like they'll form picket lines, or they'll go into an auditorium where a speaking event is happening, and they'll sort of surround everyone in there, and they'll like bang against the walls, and they'll blow air horns, and they'll essentially make the speaking event impossible. You can no longer pay attention to the speaking event. They're not standing outside holding up a sign in, imagine a anti-abortion, like a pro-life protester standing outside Planned Parenthood with like a picture of a dead fetus or something. That's not what they're doing in most of the cases of note. And so I think and that's a key distinction, right? Because that's the distinction between exercising your free speech without impugning on anybody else versus literally preventing somebody else from speaking, whether it's from a physical body or from the noise that you're making or from the threat that you might impose of security costs or starting a riot or stuff like that.
Right. So, I mean, is it possible to figure out if this is a thing that's getting worse? Because I mean...
Yeah, people have been working on it.
I know it's gotten worse from basically before Milo was a big deal to the point where Milo was going on tours. Like I know it got worse in that period, but I don't know if it's gotten worse since Milo has pretty much disappeared. I don't think I've heard about this kind of thing escalating since then. And even when it was just Milo, it seemed like such a small minority of people causing most of the problems.
Well, the Shapiro event happened last year in 2017.
What happened there? Somebody got assaulted?
No, it was in Berkeley, and so Shapiro, also kind of funny because Shapiro is notably anti-Trump and was anti-Trump all the way up until the election.
Right.
But sometime after the election, in the 2016 presidential election, Shapiro came to Berkeley, Ben Shapiro, and he was giving a speech, which was part of like a free speech conference or free speech rally. There's supposed to be like a series of events basically, and he was like one of the headliners, and it was hosted by the Berkeley College Republicans. So he came to campus to give this speech, and because all of this stuff had been coming to a head, and like a lot of people on the left were sort of mobilizing against Donald Trump in particular, but then like just right-leaning people in general as well, and like quote unquote the alt-right. And so they had shown an active pattern of protesting. They had protested Milo, they protested Ann Coulter at Berkeley, and then many times, at least a couple of times, this led to maybe not a full-on riot, but some level of violence and property damage. Like there was scuffling, and there's some garbage cans being thrown. So in light of that, and because these tensions were rising, and some people had actually sent letters to the campus administration, like the Berkeley campus administration, saying basically like, we would really like you to shut this event down. And I don't know how intentional or pernicious this was, but there is this sort of vibe like from The Godfather.
It would be a shame if something happened.
Right. Like it would be a shame if something happened as a result of these speakers coming on campus.
Yeah.
And I don't think they were specifically, I wouldn't call it threatening violence, but they were basically saying like, if this happens, there's going to be a really big protest and it's going to be messy, right?
Yeah.
And the administrator said, and they actually got a lot of flack for this, they put out a public statement about free speech saying these groups want to invite the speaker to the campus. They've gone through all of the appropriate measures that they have. Why shouldn't they be able to invite someone to speak? We, as representatives of free speech, and being in some ways the home of the free speech movement in the 60s, we have to let them talk. We have to embody these values. If we can't let the opposition talk, then how could you expect to speak in the future when you might be the opposition? And then people, largely just like shit all over the Berkeley administration for that, saying that they were, apologizing for or defending like the alt-right. But anyway, so ultimately what happened is Shapiro came. He required $600,000 worth of campus security. And this was, it's like January 2017 or so. And I actually went to the campus that day because I was in Berkeley for a different reason. I just like walked around, and they had set this like huge perimeter around the hall where the speaking event was to take place. And they had like cops. It almost kind of looked like the SWAT team. It wasn't SWAT. It was just probably the campus police, but they had police stationed at like every like walking path and like bridge and trail and alleyway that went all the way around maybe a mile radius of the building. And it was in some ways true. The protest was really big. And maybe they did actually need that security. And the fact that, I mean, maybe they didn't, maybe it was an overreaction, but the fact that it wasn't Berkeley College Republicans that were, crowdfunded $600,000 for the security. It was the campus administration. And so the protest essentially imposed this cost of $600,000 on the speaking events to happen.
Yeah.
And I mean, the thing is, we're talking about free speech here. It's not like Ben Shapiro was giving a speech about, I mean, he's Jewish, but it's not like he was giving a speech about blood and soil.
Right.
It's not like he was saying, we should go out and like lynch the gays or whatever. I mean, he like 50% of his talk was about free speech itself and about the campus itself, and the other 50% was about like classical liberalism and like free markets and stuff.
Well, I guess my perspective here is that as far as there's an idea going around among progressive leftists in colleges, an idea that says, we should be shutting down speakers at any cost. As far as that's a real idea that's going around, I obviously disagree with that. But I don't know how prevalent that idea is compared to, say, the idea of white nationalism that's going around right now. And I think a lot of people on the left see people like Sam Harris and Peterson and Shapiro and whoever else in this
the intellectual dark web.
In this dark web, they see them paying a lot of attention to the small minority of vocal progressives on campuses who are taking protests too far in a minority of cases, let's say. And they make a lot about that, but they don't spend nearly as much time and energy talking about actual Nazis, espousing actual Nazi views.
Right.
And they see that as a weird mismatch of priorities, I think. And I'm a little bit sympathetic to that. I don't quite see... I support a short hair trigger on the free speech ideal as a rule, I think, because like Harris says, it really is the uber ideal. Like, it's the uber value. It's the value that helps us determine all of our other values. If we lose this one value, we have nowhere to go. So I support a kind of a hair trigger on that, but I see Nazism as kind of the same amount of dangerous, to be honest. And it's hard to have Nazism and free speech at the same time, too.
Why is that?
Well, Nazism has very specific views on how a society should look. And if you're kind of outside of that specific view, you kind of just don't belong here, I think is the view of a lot of Nazis. Mm-hmm. So I think... I don't.
So you think if Nazis controlled the world, there would not be very much free speech?
Well, I mean, I think that was demonstrably true when Nazis were threatening to take over the world.
Right. So, So I just want to be clear that you were making an argument for why free speech would be good, because, as a general rule, because it works against Nazis as well, or it would in principle.
Sure.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think to your point about the quote unquote vocal minority of progressives, I have noticed progressives or center leftists or whoever bring that up as a point, but I don't think it's a very good point, because the literal protesters are a minority because there's simply not that many of them that physically gather. But I mean, you could say teachers are a minority. What percent of the population are teachers? But I mean, that's still it's still a significant number of people, and people that aren't teachers pay teachers and they get taught by teachers. So it's not like the influence is localized to that group. And so, I mean, if you flip the logic around, I'm sure the progressives would readily agree, even if there's quote unquote only 3,000 people that show up to a Nazi rally, which is what happened in Charlottesville, they'll talk about there's like dog whistling, and there's a network of people that share the ideas, and the ideas are being disseminated, whether it's on the very, very farthest right, like the Daily Stormer, or it could be stuff like far right light, like Alex Jones talking about the conspiracy theories and the Jews and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so, well, I don't know if Alex Jones talks about the Jews that way, but I mean, that's the whole point anyway. And I think that from the left is a legitimate concern, which is that you might have some vocal people who are actually talking about Nazism, and then a bunch of people who might either secretly or like explicitly endorse it. And that's where you have the problem, right? Is not the small number of people. It's the huge number of people that will either endorse it or be shaped by the ideology. And so that's the same argument against, for instance, a person like Charles Murray, because they're saying, well, he might not explicitly be a Nazi, and he might not be explicitly calling for racist like laws or policies, but because he's promoting a system of like systemic racism, or because he has kind of lived in the general area of other people who are white supremacists, he's sort of guilty by association. And I don't believe that's true, but that's a similar type logic, right? So if you have a quote unquote minority of people protesting or engaging in, let's say, violent or like destructive protests, then the question isn't necessarily who exactly are those people and how much and how many of them are they. It's like, well, let's look at the reaction from the wider community. Does the left say, oh, wow, those guys are way out of line. They don't represent us at all. Or is the left saying like, that's good. There should be more, people should protest. People who have, conservatives shouldn't be allowed to speak at my campus. I don't want that. And I think that's generally something that we are seeing. Like it seems like the actions of the protests and the activists seem to be broadly supported by the progressive community. And that counts for the protesters against conservative speakers, and also counts stuff like Black Lives Matter protesters, right, or in a larger scale like the Women's March. Like if you were to compare the Women's March with like Charlottesville, I mean, like what happens in Charlottesville was there's like an extremely organized and coordinated effort to find like all of the Nazis around the area and bring them together in one place at one time. Mm-hmm. And they got like 1,000 people or like 3,000 people. Yeah. And that was like the best they can do basically. And then they got shut down. And as far as I can tell, stuff like that barely ever happens. And when it does, it's covered by the news heavily. But then like something like the Women's March, not to say that those are equivalent in any way, but I just mean if you're looking at something that the left supports, the Women's March, if you just say, oh, there's going to be a Women's March on San Francisco tomorrow, like 1 million people will show up. Yeah. I mean, that's like barely even an exaggeration. Like last year, I think in the greater Bay Area, it was certainly millions that were marching in combination of San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose. There's one in Washington, D.C. There's one, I was like traveling in Australia and they had a women's march in Australia.
Yeah, well, I mean,
after the election.
You don't have to be explicitly progressive, though, to participate in something called the Women's March. You could be pretty much anywhere on the center to the left and even probably somewhere on the right. And still participate in that. Whereas,
but that totally depends on what you believe it's about and how you perceive your group membership.
Yeah, but it's easier to believe that it's about something closer to your own perspective than, hey, let's get a bunch of white dudes together and march about nationalism and Aryan pride. Like that's you have to be in a very specific niche to get out of your house and go grab a tiki torch and do that, as opposed to let's march for 50% of the population.
Well, right. But I mean, I think that what you're getting at is essentially the point, which is that the views on the progressive left are the mainstream now. Like it's very easy to pull in people from the center and say, hey, we're all going to march for women, even if it's organized by like a small number of fairly radical progressive feminists. And I mean, then there's all this hullabaloo about like Linda Sarsour and stuff, which I'm not going to talk about, but you guys can Google it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line for me here is that I don't want to make too much hay about people complaining about free speech being under attack, because if it is under attack and I'm just confused, then I mean somebody should be complaining about it for sure. And so I support a hair trigger here.
Yeah,
so,
and I mean if you're not sure in terms of the greater social complexity of it, like okay, I don't know the statistics, I don't know all the colleges in the US, like I haven't polled all the people. Fair enough, you may be ignorant of that. But if you want to just do like a gut check, and anyone can do this, you can just think, okay, I've got some liberal friends and some conservative friends. I've got some liberal ideas and some conservative ideas. How likely am I, like if I think about the idea of bringing together my liberal friends and telling them my conservative ideas, what's the chances that they're going to be happy about that? Right. Or that they're going to take it seriously? As far as I'm concerned, it's pretty low. Mm-hmm. I mean, at least I know for me personally, there's like a ton of stuff that I've been interested in terms of traditionally, well, either conservative or like even liberal, but like classically liberal ideology that I've been exposed to. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. I wish I could share it with someone, but I'm like, I'm not going to put it on my Facebook because I know that I have a ton of progressive friends that will be like, oh, well, don't you know that Jordan Peterson is like a Nazi? Like, why are you sharing this?
Is this just because...
I'm worried about you. Like,
yeah. Is this just because conservatives are the minority in intellectual circles? Like, is this just like a rule by majority thing? Like, conservatives are just used to hearing other people's views. So, like, there's nothing about conservatism that makes you more tolerant to opposing views. It's just kind of like if you're a conservative and you didn't go to like a conservative college, you just went to an average college and the average college is center left. Mm-hmm. You're just used to hearing those and you're used to arguing with people or debating. Or is that all this is?
Well, it depends if you're talking about like raw numbers of people. So like so earlier you mentioned we were talking about the mainstream media and you're like, well, it's not clear to me that these like Enlightenment values, Western liberal democracy stuff, that seems pretty mainstream. How is that not mainstream? But if you think about it, there's like two types of mainstream, where one is just physical numbers of people, and then the other is the sort of dominant information networks and like power structures. So I think what we all observed in America after the election of Donald Trump is a bunch of liberals were like, oh shit, there's like a bunch of people that just voted for this doofus. Like, what the heck? Like, I literally know one person out of like 5,000 people I know that voted for him, or at least I think it was only one, because maybe they wouldn't have told me. But then now it's like 50% or like 49% electoral college, blah, 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 percent of America actually came out and voted for Trump. And maybe like 30% of them had him as their first choice. And so I think what is happening there is you're seeing that it's true that a lot of conservative thoughts and ideology and stuff like obviously mainstream Christian values and then maybe slightly more niche like libertarian type stuff, that is mainstream in terms of there's a lot of like literal Americans that believe in that, but it's not mainstream in that a large amount of the media environment doesn't cover those things. It does. They generally lean progressive and they tend to lean less conservative, less religious, less traditional, I'm having trouble with the word liberal, but like less classically liberal, I suppose.
Yeah. So do we characterize these intellectual dark web views as conservative views, or are they just kind of on the conservative side and we've got these centrists saying, well, hey, some elements of these views are viable and worth talking about in this conversation, and you're just not talking about them, liberal media?
Right.
Is that what's going on?
Well, it does depend. It starts to get a little bit hairy because one thing that the classical liberals like to do, or especially Dave Rubin or Ben Shapiro, they'll go back and look at the founding fathers of the United States and they'll be like, here's what the founding fathers believed. They believed in, states' rights and small federal government and freedom of speech and Second Amendment and stuff like that, right? Freedom, etc. And so from the classical liberal perspective, that is liberalism. That is sort of the foundation of Western liberal democracy. But that's obviously not guaranteed. I mean, if you're going to compare that to stuff like traditional societies, you could even look at a place like India today, or a place like something like Saudi Arabia, right? Like Saudi Arabia, you would say is like fairly right conservative. To call Saudi Arabia conservative and then bring that label over to the US would be ridiculous.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're talking about relative, like
right.
Back the founding fathers' ideas were progressive then,
right,
and now they're kind of conservative,
right? So if we want to talk relativistically, then we can use the labels progressive and conservative to say conservative is like protecting the status quo, or maybe even moving like backwards slightly to an older society, and then progressive is moving forward, like change, moving towards some like future different state. And so I think if we're going to consider those as relative concepts, but then like liberal, if we want to defend that as being like classically liberal, this is in a more like objective political science-y type sense. So it doesn't necessarily represent quote unquote liberals in the US today.
Right.
Then I would say almost everyone in the intellectual dark web is either classically liberal or classical liberal adjacent. Like they broadly believe in free speech and free markets and liberty. And it's easy in our modern environment to think about that as like obvious, like, oh, obviously everyone should agree about that. But it seems like it's increasingly less obvious. Like there's a lot of people that actually don't believe in those things. Or they'll say that they believe in them, but then they'll also support something like free college tuition for everybody. Yeah. It's like, oh, free college tuition to everybody. It has the word free in it. So that means we're talking about freedom. And it's like, well, obviously there's some implication there that if there's quote unquote free college education, then there's a bunch of people who have to work for it or like are forced in some way, either directly through slavery, which is probably not going to happen. Like, you're not going to enslave the professors, or indirectly through basically threatening everybody in the country with violence if they don't pay you to set up the system.
Sure.
And so I think it's pretty clear that something like an idea like free college tuition for everyone, whether or not it's actually going to happen anytime soon, it's not that fringe of an idea. I mean, this was like a major platform of Bernie Sanders, who was almost the Democratic nominee for president.
Yeah, it was a real idea that people were talking about.
Right.
And are 2 years ago. Yeah,
and are talking about. And I mean, I think that if you're going to, you can look at the polling data and you can sort of decide for yourself, but there seems to be a fairly reasonable correlation between people who are on the left politically, or let's say progressive in today's context. They share values with identity politics, and they have some idea about, women or minorities or racial minorities or sexual identities not being represented and basically needing to be redistributed power in some way, quote unquote, smash the patriarchy. They're very left economically in that they tend to call for like pretty high, pretty progressive taxes and very large social entitlement programs. So that could count stuff like welfare, like existing welfare. It could count Medicare, Medicaid, mostly Medicaid. It could count...
Are we going to put reparations in this?
Yeah, it could count reparations. I don't know how mainstream that is at this point, but...
It's a main platform of the Black Lives Matter group if you go on their website.
Right. A lot of the now mainstream opinions of people on the left, they seem to be in some way like morally virtuous, or they imply like a compassion towards people who have less, like whether it's poor people or people who are in like historically oppressed groups. But at the same time, you could say that those are good things, but they're not essentially about liberty or freedom. They're not about classical liberal values of stuff like free markets or free speech or right to property.
Yeah, but you can
rights.
narrativize those as compassionate too, because I mean, what's the reason that people want a totally free market? It's because they think that that's the best way to organize the economy such that all boats rise together and working class people can actually make a living. They think...
Well, it depends who you're talking about. I mean, if you're going to ask somebody like Ayn Rand, who is an incredibly influential philosopher on the modern right, she wouldn't say that we want something like free markets so that everybody can be as happy as possible. That just happens to be a nice side effect. Really, the core moral principle is that the essential moral agent is the individual. It's you. I mean, you could say it's everybody is an individual, but the whole point is that it's you. And whoever you are, it's you. You're the individual. And so from a Randian perspective, she would say, it might be moral, quote unquote moral, to like sacrifice myself so that I could like give my organs out to everybody or something, or give all my money away.
Yeah, but I mean, even Rand argues that it is your moral duty to be selfish. Like that's what objectivism is.
Right. Sorry, that's what I was saying, quote unquote moral, because there's your own idea of morality, and then there's like there's a social idea. So the social idea of morality there is that you should be selfless and like give your money to charity and like volunteer and make an impact and stuff like that. And then there's the moral philosophy that says that it's your duty to work for the betterment of yourself as much as possible.
Right.
And so I think that it's not thinking about classical liberal ideas in terms of compassion or even in terms of like utilitarianism. It's one argument for them. It's one defense of them, especially if you're talking to high compassion utilitarians. But I think that if you're really thinking about philosophically, that's typically not the prime directive. It's not just that there's like a bunch of, we're agnostic about any sort of social system, and it turns out that this social system just happens to have the best outcome. It's also that it's morally and like deeply right in that the correct moral agent is the individual.
Right. Okay, well, so we've only talked really about like free speech as far as what views connect the people in this intellectual dark web. So the other two I've heard are identity politics and kind of biological differences, and that sort of almost goes in hand. So
we can maybe call it social construction or social constructivism.
So what I want to know is, do you think Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro kind of agree about identity politics, or do they just disagree with the far left?
Well, I think there's a couple things that they might agree or disagree with. I mean, so what you just mentioned you mentioned identity politics, and then like social constructivism / the opposite, which would be like biological essentialism, maybe nature versus nurture in layman's terms. I think So Ben, he really likes to say this phrase, facts don't care about your feelings, and facts. He's always talking about facts and science and evidence. Show me the evidence, stuff like that. I mean, he's a lawyer after all. So I think his philosophy is slightly more based in like fact and truth. And I think that he opposes the left insofar as they deny stuff like the correlation between gender and sex, because sometimes the identity politics left will often say that they're not related, they're separate concepts. And then he'll talk about stuff like evidence for difference in the genders. He'll talk about like economic evidence. So he'll say like, oh, there's no evidence that, well, I don't want to misrepresent his political opinions, but he might hypothetically say something like, there's no evidence for the benefits of the minimum wage. So you can't just support the minimum wage because you like care about people and you're so nice and you want to give everything away. You need to have some idea of what the facts are and what the like experts say in order to have an opinion on it. Not to have an opinion, but to have a valid opinion, I guess, that or a valid argument. I think Sam Harris is probably more, he seems to care more about well, actually, I don't know. Maybe he cares about both things. I was going to say he seems to care more about the identity politics, but I'm not quite sure.
What I see connecting these people is that they just disagree with the far left's depiction of identity politics. It's not necessarily that they agree about their own kind of construction of it. Like they don't have the same views about, like, I don't know, what should we do with the inner cities, or how should we depict racial minorities in popular media, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine they have the exact same views on those things. They just kind of don't agree with how the far left is going about it.
Yeah. So while you're saying that, I came to a little epiphany. I think Sam is much more characterized by, I'm going to psychoanalyze them a little bit. Sam is much more characterized by openness, which is that his personality is such that he's like highly open to new ideas. And, he's the sort of prototypical, into mindfulness meditation and psychedelic drugs and stuff like that. And so you'll notice when he talks, whether it's about the American left or otherwise, he'll say stuff like, we should consider these possibilities, or we shouldn't be closed to the possibility that this could be true. We shouldn't make assumptions that will cause us to ignore, well, not necessarily ignore the evidence, but like not be open to new ideas. And so I think his perspective is like, the main danger of the identity politics left is not identity politics per se, but that the ideology results in like a shutting down of opinion. It'll say, oh, because you're a white man, you don't get to have thoughts about this thing, or your thoughts aren't legitimate. And so he's like, there's no essential reason why an argument or like a conversation can't be had. Like really what you should care about is the content of the conversation and the ideas. Ideas matter. This is the whole thing. Ideas matter. And I think that Shapiro, he's much more characterized by disagreeableness, and to a degree, well, they're all conscientious, but let's say he's mainly characterized by disagreeableness. So he'll say things like, it's not just that, oh, we should be like more open to ideas and we need to be able to talk about things. He says, we have facts. Your facts are wrong. My facts are right. And we need to like just pay attention to the evidence and like follow it. And what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. And we need to follow what's right. So Sam's much more like, let's like open the door to more conversations, and the identity politicians are closing the door. And then Shapiro's like, we already figured this out. We've got the facts, we've got the evidence, and if we don't, we need more facts and evidence, not emotional or moral, what's the word for this? We don't want to rely on our emotional intuitions to make decisions, especially about policy.
Right.
And so I think that his disagreement with the left tends to be a lot more epistemic in that way, whereas maybe Sam's is a little bit more, I don't know. It's hard to really articulate it, but that's mainly what I see being the difference between them. Right. It just happens that they now have this common enemy, and that's where they ally. But of course, if you rewind more than a couple of years ago, there's no way they would have been aligned on basically anything. I mean, right. Shapiro is like a hardline religious fundamentalist in a lot of ways.
Right. Okay. Let me go back to something you just said about opening doors. I mean, I think there's some doors that Sam's trying to close. Right. Like he straight up just says that identity politics shouldn't exist in 2018 or whenever he tweeted that. And I kind of want to know, like, how does he know that?
Well, I think when he says identity politics, he'll say something like, we know that this is not the way towards a free society. We know that it's not the way to have like good conversations.
It was in the 1960s. It worked then. And I think you're hard pressed to find somebody who would disagree that it worked then. And that was the way. Well, I mean, how else were we supposed to organize a way for this community to not be oppressed? Like,
well, I think
they had to organize by race.
It kind of did. I mean, I think what happened it did necessarily as a result of laws that treated different races differentially. So like if you showed up to a protest and half of the people were white and half were black, maybe only the black people would get beaten or arrested or something, right? Hypothetically. But I think what we saw then was less about, I mean, it was about racism and it was about prejudice and it was about discrimination under the law. But I think that's much better characterized by liberalism than it is by identity politics. I mean, because even Martin Luther King himself, I mean, his famous speech, the most famous thing he ever said was that we should consider people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin.
Right.
And identity politics says the color of your skin matters to who you are. If you are black, then what you say is going to matter more in a certain context than if you're white. If you're a woman, what you're going to say is going to matter more than if you're a man.
Yeah, and I mean, abstractly, I agree with you in general about these things, but the only thing that gives me a little bit of pause here is that back then, the white moderates were saying about the same thing that they're saying now, and that they were kind of arguing for the status quo in the same way that they're arguing for the status quo now. And they kind of just had blinders on to what was going to actually solve the problems back then. And I think if all that happened was protests with MLK that were totally nonviolent and they just got sprayed down in the street by fire hoses for years and years and years, I'm not sure anything would have gotten done. I think you needed this wing of aggressive political actors in like Malcolm X, if not for the ideas that they brought to the table, but just for the kind of, hey, we're serious about this.
That's contested, academically speaking. I mean, I see where you're going with it. We will, Justice, we'll bring this back to the intellectual dark web. Because there's an argument. I mean, I'm not a sociologist, not an anthropologist. I didn't really study this stuff, but I have like kind of looked into it. And people have done sort of case studies / literature reviews, I guess, where they'll go back and they'll look at previous activist movements, including the American Civil Rights Movement, but as well as a bunch of other stuff like environmentalism. And they'll say which tactics were more effective, the tactics that were sort of like violent and aggressive, and then painted a sort of like us versus them narrative, like oppressed versus the man, or were the tactics that were more effective ones that emphasize like common humanity and shared values?
Well, yeah, but we don't know that, like, we know that the latter tactics might have been more effective, and ultimately that was the right way to go, but we don't know whether those tactics were only effective because the alternative was the former tactics. Mm-hmm. We don't know what the relationship is between those. And I'm not pretending to know. I'm just worried that I'm going to be the same kind of person who says, no, everything's fine here. This is how we conduct ourselves in polite society. Things aren't bad enough that we need to use these types of tactics. I don't want to go down that road without knowing what I'm talking about.
Right. Well, previously you mentioned status quoism, where it's sort of like you were saying in the civil rights era, the moderates were maybe saying they were in a bad way complacent with the status quo of institutional racism and more like legalized, how would you say, like Jim Crow type racism. And then you might say, okay, well, the moderates today who are status quoist, I mean, we'll just assume by definition the moderate center is status quoist because that's what that means. So then you might say, oh, the ones today who are now sort of swept into and part of identity politics, now that's status quo and they're complacent with that. Is that an accurate representation of what you're saying?
Yeah.
So the implication there, I think your implication was that status quo is sort of like a negative thing, which is that if we're going to change or if we're going to have progress, we can't just be part of the status quo. We've like sort of got to shake things up, right? And I think that, well, first of all, that obviously completely depends on what your view of the status quo is. If the status quo is bad, then yes, we should change things. And I think it has more of a negative connotation now, at least in the way it's used. But if the status quo is good, then you certainly want to work to preserve it. And it would be ridiculous to say, oh, the status quo is never good at all, because obviously you can go too far. And so the idea of progressivism as like a relative concept, I think progressives politically, like currently, can get easily trapped by saying, yes, we're progressive and a little bit more progressive is good, but it's always better to be more progressive. Like more progressive is always better. So the furthest progressive you can get, like gender, communist, robot transhumanism, like that's the best thing, right? Like more progressive, the better. And I think that, I mean, that's not the view of the majority, but I'm just saying that's sort of a caricature. But I think what the takeaway from from thinking about things this way is that, from thinking about progressivism and conservatism, relatively speaking, is that you can be too progressive and you can be too conservative. And so too conservative might be like, yeah, you want to do something like Saudi Arabia and you want to keep your women inside and they can't drive around, or it's getting better there. So I don't want to be too aggressive about that. But nobody can be an atheist. If you're an atheist, you'll be, it's legally okay to like beat or kill you or something. And I think that the progressives, at least right now, seem to be of the opinion that more progressive is pretty much always better within reason. And it's just a matter of like gaining the political power to do that, or like convincing moderates of that. And any amount of conservative is pretty much bad. Like if you just step a little bit to the line towards conservatism, that's bad. And whereas the conservatives, as far as I can tell, they'll say, there is a line at what's too conservative, and we definitely don't want to be that. And medium liberals are just fine. Like,
yeah, but I mean, the conservatives, like Ben Shapiro conservatives, they'll decry Nazism, but they don't spend as much time like this is the point I made earlier. They don't spend as much time talking about Nazis as they do about the far left.
Right. And that's because it's not as mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this weird thing where a like David Pakman or Sam Cedar type like center leftist is sort of apologetic to the people that are more left than they are, in a way that even though they're closer politically to a Sam Harris, they see that person as farther than them, even though like there's someone right next to them that they're patting on the back who's saying, let's take over the means of production and
right. Revolution.
Yeah, cut off all the rich people's heads. Even though that person is like crazy far away from Sam Cedar and David Pakman on the political spectrum, they're for whatever reason more apologetic to that than somebody slightly to the right of them.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, what they'll do is they'll see someone like, say, Ben Shapiro or someone more on the right, politically speaking, they'll be like, oh, this person had lunch with the cousin of David Duke like 30 years ago. And so obviously that person is a Nazi, right?
Yeah.
Or, I mean, had lunch. I mean, that's like really extreme. It's more like they were mentioned in the same tweet as a third party who was talking about both of them. It's just, the chain of connection you have to get to someone who's even like a little bit vaguely white supremacist in order for you to be implied in that is way more than like, like you said, your freaking brother could be a member of the Communist Party and it's fine. Like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think the weird thing here, and this is the kind of the direction that I was trying to go. I think Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris are who we keep going back to, because I think Sam kind of represents the left side of this IDW, and Ben Shapiro kind of represents the right side.
Right.
I'm not sure if there's anybody on the like we can talk about who belongs on this list, but I'm not sure if there's anybody farther left than Sam or farther right than Shapiro.
Sure.
So what I think is weird is that I think his conception of what should we do about the inner cities, I think that's so much more compatible with far left progressivism than Ben Shapiro's conception, like bootstraps, just let them deal with it themselves. It's all like all on you. The government doesn't have to do anything to help you. And yet, weirdly, Shapiro and Harris are allied here. This is really odd to me. And I don't know if it's just because the left has rejected Sam, or if it's because Shapiro and Sam think that they're closer together than they actually are.
Well, essentially, they don't think, if I'm putting on my Jordan Peterson hat here, it's not that they're united over politics, because they're not. They're very politically different. They're actually united over religion. Not specifically religion, but they're just because they're both Jews. This is the Alex Jones line of thinking, but more that their moral values and belief systems, and you might call them religious belief systems, are embedded in like Western liberalism, which is essentially like Protestant Christianism with like a little bit of Jewishness thrown in there. I think then the argument is like, so belief in the individual as the like prime moral agent sort of essentially emerges out of Christian belief in like Jesus and the Son and what that represents. And there's some contention about that. But I mean, say that you're leaving the religious stuff aside. The point is, like we mentioned earlier, they're both united over these ideas about like free speech and about liberalism. And while they may disagree about the politics, they both agree that they should be able to get together and disagree about those politics. That's like a thing they should be allowed to do. Sam would never say, I'm not going to have Shapiro on my podcast because I found out yesterday that he said something bad about gays, so I'll never talk to him. Instead, he'll say, okay, you've got an opinion about gay rights that I don't agree with, so let's talk about it. Let's work it out. Let's maybe not treat each other as allies per se, but like, okay, so maybe you can think about it similar to martial arts. Say you're going to go to a karate tournament or something, and at the karate tournament, even if you're going full Karate Kid and the other guy is like some evil, was the bad guy in the Karate Kid a Nazi? What was he? He was just a dickhead, right? I remember he was Aryan.
I don't know.
I feel like there's something bad about him. Like, I don't remember what it was. Anyway, even if you hate the guy that you're fighting against, the morally correct thing to do in that system is like, you still train, you train in the same art, you show up to the same gym, and you bow. And you bow before the fight and you bow after the fight. And you show like this mutual respect to your opponent who is your opponent, and you still want to beat them. But you're saying it's not just important that I beat you because I could find you on the street and kick the shit out of you. I think they did maybe approach that in Karate Kid because they like went after Mr. Miyagi, right? The like bad karate gang or something. Didn't they like?
I haven't seen this movie since I was a child.
Yeah, fair enough. Anyway, if I was more like Peterson, I would have like studied the narrative structure and integrated it into this analogy. But anyway, that's sort of what I see is that as that Sam and maybe you could say Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instead. So Sam and Shapiro both want to do Jiu-Jitsu and they want to compete with each other, but they're going to agree to the rules. They're going to show up to the ring. They're going to, bow before and after, and they want to respect the decision of the judges and of the rules of the game. And they see other people as coming in and saying, hey, look, that other guy, I don't like him or I don't like the way he fights or whatever. So let's like beat him up in the back alley with pipes. Or even worse, like I couldn't beat you otherwise and I would compete with you. So let's change the rules or let's, stack it in favor of a person who's, let's say that if you're 100 pounds, the other person's 150 pounds, instead of fighting another person that's 100 pounds, instead you get to have a knife that you bring to the fight with the 150 pound guy. So they're sort of seeing it as they now, meaning I suppose the radical left or people who are against social, like you might say the current social fabric would say, let's destroy it or let's change the rules so that it's better. And we're not, if there's someone who opposes us, we're not like competing with them on the same ground. We don't want to give them a platform.
But this analogy only works if people like Ezra Klein aren't taking people into the alley and beating them with pipes. But like Ezra Klein can go on Sam Harris's podcast and Klein thinks it's a good productive conversation and Sam afterwards calls the left irredeemable and he like calls Ezra Klein far left. Mm-hmm. I think it's obvious that Sam Harris is closing some doors and he's not willing to talk to everybody. He won't talk to Ta-Nehisi Coates. Who are the other people?
Well, I think if you were going to extend the analogy, which I don't know how useful this really is, but if you're going to extend the analogy, obviously it's not like pipes to pipes. In the Karate Kid analogy, it is you go and beat someone else with pipes instead of fighting them, on equal ground in the ring. But in the speaker, in the intellectual analogy, it's like if you're going to contend with Sam Harris, you should contend with his ideas and not say, well, you're just a white man or you have associated with like racialist ideology or something. It's sort of like the way that Klein is cheating is not threatening to beat Sam up or sending people to his house or whatever. It's that he is, instead of just talking at the level of philosophy or argumentation or reason or whatever, he's invoking things outside of that. He's saying, here's this notion that is in some ways like purely or essentially subjective, which is that if you have not had a quote like lived experience of a black person, you can't even like look at the data. If you look at the data, you're like implicitly biased against it.
Right.
And then Sam's saying like, but we have to look at the data. Like anybody could play this game, and we're increasingly seeing the people on the right do it, on the far white supremacist ethno-nationalist right. And And we can't do that. We've got to maintain the rules of the game. We've got to fight fair. So
yeah, but Alex, all we have to do is play that game and then just kill all of the Nazis or punch them.
Punch the Nazis.
They can't play the game.
Optimal Nazi punching. Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely no way that they'll be able to do anything. They won't be able to communicate with each other secretly if we are punching them.
Yeah, that technology doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's like some sort of like black network. Some like information black network or something.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think this was really productive. Is there anything else we want to hit?
Well, maybe we could. We've talked a little bit. Well, first of all, we've kind of been a little bit myopic. We've only been talking about a few people. I like how you said that Ben Shapiro represents the right side, and then Sam sort of represents the left side, and then maybe in the center is the Weinsteins or something. They seem kind of all over the place. But going away from the individual personalities and talking more about like the broader community, there's a pretty big, like rapidly growing following of Shapiro, Harris, Peterson, Rubin. They're growing on YouTube. They're growing in the podcast space. They're growing on Twitter. And while there isn't necessarily there's not one strong organized community around all of them. There's like a lot of little like distributed networks and like, what do you call it? A whisper. There's like a whisper network of people that are talking about these things, maybe not with their friends or family, but they're sharing each other podcast links, and they're going on the Reddit, and they're sorting each other out over Discord and stuff like that. And I think that this, if anything, does provide just the observing the way that this thing has evolved provides some evidence for the legitimacy of the quote intellectual dark web, which is that these people don't want to be talking in the mainstream. And when the information is represented in the mainstream, it's usually like, whoa, there's this like crazy right-wing guy. What's he going to say? Or like, what's the progressive left take on this like right-wing guy's views? Instead of like, oh, these are center classical liberals that don't like far leftists, right? And so I think that I personally find that super interesting. And I think that we're going to see that more and more of stuff, places like YouTube or mechanisms like Patreon that are going to fund what these people are doing, because it's all fundamentally like grassroots and distributed. I would be surprised if any of them get something like a nighttime TV show. I think that's just dying. Right. I think they're sort of leading the charge into... like they might represent the future mainstream just because they're actually taking advantage of technology and stuff. And to an extent, this is also what you're seeing with Trump. Not that he's intellectual or dark in any way, but that he's a little orange, but
dark orange.
Yeah, dark orange. But that he does represent like a sort of blind spot. Like there's a bunch of people who seem to, if not support him specifically, support the general thing that he was trying to do and go against the like quote unquote mainstream like liberal establishment. And I think that while I'm hoping that he's not the future, he represented something clearly. And I hope that this intellectual dark web is a way to sort of add legitimacy and like philosophical flavor to the sentiment behind that, which I don't think was like deeply white supremacist as everyone else says. I think it was more like, we don't like the status quo of the mainstream. You can ask most Trump voters, they'll say that it was more or less a protest vote. They just didn't want Hillary again.
To differing degrees. Like they were protesting different things.
To different degrees. But I think there is, there are some MAGA fanboys like from the beginning, but I think most of that just ended up being a reaction to progressive, when
liberal
Clinton,
smugness.
Yeah, smugness. and when Clinton called them deplorables, that was like a huge rallying cry. Yeah. If she never used that word even, I mean, I'm not really too harsh on Clinton. I mean, if you're a politician, you're just going to say stuff and it'll blow up. But like, I think if she had been more careful and not ever used a word like that and didn't give them like a brand, that could have hurt a lot. And I think that was less a reaction of like white supremacists being like, oh, here's a chance for us to be even more like deplorable. That was, it's obvious it was a form of satire. It was like, oh, you're going to call us this? Then like, fine, we'll act like shitheads because that you've already branded us that as that anyway. And I think the intellectual dark web is sort of saying maybe the Trump supporters are kind of stupid. If we're talking about Ben and Sam as sort of vanguards of this movement, clearly they don't like Trump at all, and they're quite vocal about that. But maybe the fundamental feeling behind that, which is that there was something wrong with the mainstream narrative and something needs to change, that's now given some legitimacy. Like smart people are thinking about it. They're not just saying like, oh, anyone who's thinking about that stuff at all is just a racist, or they're just stupid, or whatever.
Yeah, I think my perspective on this is pretty close to that. I'm hesitant to say that these are ideas and people that aren't, quote, mainstream, but I do think that this whole thing happened because these are some ideas that just aren't being interacted with in like kind of center left progressive media and social media. They're just not having conversations about it at all because of, you know, varying reasons. For if there's just like a radioactive feeling around some of these ideas, they just don't want to touch them. So I think that's really where this is going to go. Is it's just going to be kind of an outlet for the people who have any kind of concern about free speech or identity politics. And it's not necessarily that they all share the same ideas about what those things should look like, but they definitely don't agree with how the left is depicting them.
Right. And I think, again, just slightly going back to this idea of mainstream, if you look at the mainstream progressive / center left, you know, we've been talking about how the intellectual dark web is getting more popular on, or they're growing through places like YouTube and podcasts and such. But if you look at the left, you know, you can go to Jordan Peterson and look at one of his videos and see, oh, wow, that's like really good. He got 1 million views on that or something. Like, clearly this is gaining traction. But then, you know, 2 seconds later, you can be like, oh, well, that video by John Oliver last night got like 10 million views or something. And I think that doing a comparison like that, where you can look at people like John Oliver or like Rachel Maddow or Trevor Noah, and I mean, sure, that's satire, but I mean, people do get their opinions and ideas from those sources. And I think that's what we're seeing as the mainstream. And so that's maybe the mainstream left. And then you could say mainstream right is stuff like, like Fox and Friends, or like
talk radio,
or what's his name? Rush Limbaugh, and Alex Jones. And so I think the left will paint the intellectual dark web as reactionary and conservative, but I think they'll see themselves as like, well, actually, we hate Rush Limbaugh and Alex Jones too. We think they're a bunch of idiots. We think Fox is like sometimes accidentally has a good idea, but they're half idiots as well, and we'll just talk to them because they have a big audience. And it's really not so much that we're just reacting to the left, although that is a big part of the platform. It's that we could have joined these other guys, like we could have gone and worked for Fox, or we could have been in partnership with Alex Jones or something like that. Or we could hold the line and be like, we're just going to be conservatives and we're not going to let leftists like Sam Harris come into the fold. But instead what they're saying is, we're not political. We're like inherently apolitical. Like Brett Weinstein and Camille Paglia both voted for Bernie Sanders, right? And I'm sure you could go through the list and figure that out too. And a bunch of them, even Peterson, will openly talk about stuff like UBI, Universal Basic Income, as a legitimate policy. And they might have disagreements about stuff like, you know, I'm sure Sam Harris is like aggressively pro-choice and Shapiro is aggressively pro-life, which is largest single issue voting block in the US is about abortion. And I think what they're saying is they're carving out a space independent of both these political extremes. Yeah,
and the way that they view these issues that are core to the intellectual dark web, the way that they view them is inherently apolitical on aggregate. Like you can have the same kind of anti-far progressive approach to free speech and either be a Shapiro or a Sam Harris.
Right. And it is also kind of funny that, you know, there's all of this rhetoric about Nazis and like fascism and white supremacism and stuff. But like, you know, it's obvious. Okay, let's list the people who are part of this thing. Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro, Brett and Eric Weinstein, Dave Rubin. They're all Jews. Yeah. Right. And so there's this like growing band of Jewish miscreants who are being associated with Nazis. It's kind of, you know, it's kind of funny.
Yeah. And they're a gateway drug.
Yeah, they are a gateway drug to the Nazis that are ultimately believe that they are the globalist conspiracy. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think I buy any argument that starts out with this is a gateway drug. I don't see any light at the end of any of those tunnels.
Even actual gateway drugs?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do, but that's for another time. Yeah, I mean, I think just maybe in summary here, while a lot of the intellectual dark web is taking some kind of hard stance against the left, especially when it comes to free speech issues and issues on university campuses, because, I mean, in a lot of ways, university campuses are they represent the future ideology of the country because the thought leaders are coming out of the universities. And so they're targeting their efforts there. And people like Peterson have mentioned, maybe they would pay more attention to the right or to Nazis, except that there's already a somewhat clear line. Like pretty much everyone is on the same page that Nazis are bad, regardless of what the left might say. And they can draw a line and say a circle around Richard Spencer and say, that guy's bad. We're not going to work with him, or we're not going to approach that sort of ideology. And so you have a fairly large and diverse center-right area that has like a bunch of different people of different ideologies, and very few of them are Nazis or even that close to it. And even some of the like quote ethno-nationalists you could just as equally describe as nationalist. Which
well, where is the line here? But I feel like it's on one or the other side of Stephen Molyneux or Stefan Molyneux. Yeah, because there's people who will say, well, he's on the wrong side of the line here. Like we shouldn't be giving him a platform. And then there's people who, like Sam Harris gives a platform to, that don't think that go on Stefan Molyneux's show, or like Steve Rubin gives him a platform, and
Dave Rubin.
Yeah, shit. Dave Rubin gives Stefan Molyneux a platform, and Sam Harris gives Dave Rubin a platform. So shouldn't we agree on where the line is?
Right. I think that no matter what, there isn't like literally a line, like it'll be impossible to categorize perfectly. I think that Peterson's point in a lot of ways, in just like the line rhetoric, is to say that we have a sense of what's bad on the right, and it's fascism, it's Nazism. And there's some degrees where there's something in between that's acceptable. Like you could be against immigration, or you could be against multiculturalism as like a general concept and still be fine, you're within the line. But the line crosses when you are literally killing people of opposite races. Like even if you put the line really, really far, like if you push the line all the way out and you're like, the line is actually, it's even farther than Richard Spencer. It's just, so even if you're talking about like full like Nazi martial law, which obviously we're not that close to because it's not even close to a mainstream position, but even if you were talking about that and we push the line all the way to the right, and the only thing that we're going to say is outside of acceptable discourse is like genocide, that's still a line. It's something there that we're saying this is all the way on the other side. And as far as we can tell, there's no consistent opinion on what that is on the left. It used to be communism, but then we realized that that was not really a good thing to do either around the McCarthy era. And now it's not clear what it is. The left tends to, just because of their proclivity, they like to push boundaries and categories, and they're pushing it in a lot of different ways. You can push in terms of physical borders. You can push borders between categories like gender. And I think in general, the left is, it's not very clear what constitutes quote unquote the line on the left. I mean, even a radical like Bolshevik communists, it's still quite fine for them to have like a meeting in the Berkeley Student Union hall, and everyone's like, oh yeah, it's fine. Maybe I'll go. Like seems interesting.
Part of the issue here is that you can be a communist without directly hating a particular group or crossing any normal social boundaries. Like you can be a communist and have a conversation with an apolitical person, and they won't jump out of their seat at any particular thing that you say. Maybe unless you're a tanky, like if you're pro-Stalinist, then like that's something else. But like, whereas
there are those.
Yeah. Well, but like at any point on the Nazi spectrum, probably anywhere past Stefan Molyneux, if you sit down and have a conversation with an apolitical person, eventually you're going to say something where they're like, wait, what should we do with those people? And I just don't think it's quite as amenable to polite society somewhere there. So it's easier to make it obvious that everybody to the right of Stefan Molyneux is just obviously wrong.
Right.
And maybe Stefan Molyneux is too, because he talks with people that are just obviously wrong and incompatible with liberal values. Whereas, Jordan Peterson likes to say that communism killed however many millions of people, but it wasn't communism, it was authoritarianism, and communism happens to be a political system that's susceptible to authoritarianism.
Right. Yeah, and that's Peterson is generally against authoritarian. Sorry, I'm trying to like approach an end in some way.
Sure.
But just to, I guess, encapsulate the space that the intellectual dark web seems to occupy politically, is that they almost implicitly agree that there is this line on the right, and they also this is where they're differentiated from the mainstream. They believe that there is also a line on the left, which is how they're holding their strong center. And they might not actually have established what the line is. I don't even think Peterson has some ideas on what they are, but most of them haven't fully fleshed that out. But they know that there is a line somewhere. It's probably, there's some line around free speech, which is like free speech is fundamentally important. So they're crossing the line if they're against free speech. There's maybe some line if you're Sam Harris around identity politics and racial identity, and that maybe as an extension of the free speech thing, which is that people should be allowed to speak or share ideas regardless of their race. But it's not quite clear if maybe there's like a bunch of little lines everywhere, but it's not quite as easy as pointing to someone who is like anti-Semitic and they literally want to kill Jews and say, well, that's an obvious line. And to your point, it's really not obvious at all on the communist side. But the fact that it's not obvious doesn't mean that's not important. Right. I mean, part of the argument there goes is that's why it's been so pernicious. If you're a person who is against the progressive/regressive left, then you could say, well, there's an explanation. There's your explanation for why it's so pernicious. It's not just that the rest of us center people are being silly and like it's actually fine. And how could this, if communism was really so bad, then how am I perfectly good friends with like a group of communists? Yeah. And instead it's saying, actually, that's the problem. The problem is that you haven't identified that as being a problem. Like if you're polled and you say, what's your opinion on socialism, cold or hot? And everyone is saying like hot. And they might not even be able to define what socialism is when asked later, then it's clearly not that the ideology itself is a problem because they couldn't even describe it. The problem is that there's not a line that says, here's the ideology that's bad and here's like what's acceptable to have. Right.
And I mean, a far leftist would respond to this by just saying, well, that's because we're right.
Right. Exactly.
There is no line because we're on the right side of history.
Have you read Marx? Like, didn't you read... Don't you understand the surplus theory of value? Yeah. Like, come on. This is economics 1. It's like so basic. Yeah. Like, you don't even need economics 101. This is the new econ. Yeah. So anyway, I think I was just describing that because I think the intellectual dark web largely represents itself as against the left. And it's probably just because you've got this like vague ballooning cloud and it's not quite clear what you're talking about. And it's not clear where to draw the line between bad and good. And it seems like there's been encroachment, like it sort of happened under our noses, this encroachment. And so I think if the tide was to turn, which is that if the authoritarian right seemed to gain quite a lot of power, I would hope that this group or community of people would work against that.
I mean, there's an argument there, like who's in the office of the president right now. Like you could make the argument that Trump dog whistles to this community all the time.
Right.
I mean, he can't outright espouse Nazi views because then he wouldn't get elected. But he can dog whistle himself into the presidency.
Sure. I mean, the concern that Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro et al. Demonstrate is not that they think that he's like a Nazi dog whistling, because they perceive him as basically a doofus. Like, I don't even think he'd be smart enough to do it if he wanted to. And it's not a relevant size voting block. It's like, at the biggest, it would maybe be like 10%, and that's a really aggressive assumption. It's probably much smaller than that. And most, if you're going to try and dog whistle to people, just say that you're against abortion. Like, just say you're going to overturn Roe v. Wade, and you'll get half the votes immediately.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to like really pin this down because like obviously every white nationalist and every Nazi kind of considers Trump like their guy, and he's like attempting to pass policies that at least are in theory on their side, or are policies that they're sympathetic to. They're not like literal Nazi policies. They're just conservative policies. And of course, Nazis are going to be more conservative than progressive. So it's easy to paint the picture here that Trump is a dog whistling Nazi.
Well, also, I might take some issue with that, which is that you could argue that Nazis right now are actually progressive, because they're looking for like a radical change of the status quo. They're not saying, let's roll back to how we were like 50 years ago, because how we were 50 years ago, there's still like a bunch of blacks around and like a bunch of Chinese and stuff. Like, that's no good.
We just want to get them out of here.
Yeah. We need to, so in some way they're actually a little bit progressive, which is funny enough. But yeah, I mean, even if you're talking about like, you can say in like a string of commas, like white supremacist / ethno-nationalist / Nazi, but those are actually not the same thing, because, well, first of all, implied in white supremacy, if you're on the left, you're actually going to include Jews in that circle. So that can't be the same as Nazis if you think Jews are part of the group that's superior. And then if you're looking at ethno-nationalist, you can sort of add ethno to that in order to make it sound worse. But almost everybody in the entire world who is nationalist is an ethno-nationalist, because almost all the people in China are Chinese.
Yeah.
All the people in Japan are Japanese. All the people in Germany are German for the most part. And so even when we're talking about, to conflate those concepts is to say basically every country in the entire world is like evil and oppressive, because including the black ones and the brown ones and the Asian ones and whatever, because they all believe in the sovereignty of their people and their country.
I mean, if you're a communist, then that's entirely agreeable.
Yeah. And so, well, I don't know. Now I'm getting away from wrapping this up even more. But I think that to even talk about this stuff and like to suggest that ethno-nationalism and white supremacy shouldn't be said in the same line, or that Nazism or fascism shouldn't be said in the same line, that's not really even being talked about on the left at all. Like those are sort of more just like slashed together with things like racist,
or at least they're connected
homophobic,
by gateways to each other.
Right.
Like it's just kind of a different step up towards Nazism on the Nazi staircase.
Right. And I mean, whether or not, if you ask the people if they're going to like describe, if they're taking a vocab test and they're like, define white nationalism or something, they may not define them exactly the same way, but the way they think about it conceptually is all in a related category. And I think that's what to the degree that they care about intellectual honesty and respect of opposing opinions, I think that all of the members of the intellectual dark web would disagree with that sort of framing, and they would want to talk about it honestly. And I think that that's more in the spirit of what they're fighting against than against like literal Nazis.
Yeah.